could use the handheld as well, whatever is easiest. Oh, there it is. Okay, sounds good. Fabulous. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out. I appreciate it. We were supposed to have another speaker on our panel here today, but I haven't seen them yet, so we're just going to get started. I'm curious, for all of you that are here, where are you from?
Seattle.
Seattle. I grew up in Tacoma.
Tacoma.
Tacoma. I grew up in Tacoma.
I did too.
Other places?
Montana.
Olympia, Montana. Which part?
Helena.
There are 2 parts, right? At least.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, and Helena's on the plains. Yes. All right. Anybody else farther than Montana?
Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Kalamazoo. That is the funnest name. Very good. I only know it from Dr. Seuss, but yes. So yeah, I'm glad you're all here. Thank you so much for being here. It seems like it's a really exciting weekend. A lot of great connections you can make. A lot of people that you can chat with and make connections with. Learning opportunities, vendors you can buy from, etc. So I'm glad you're here. My name is Brock Dittus. They asked me to come in and talk a little bit about podcasting. I have been involved in podcasting for about 8 years now. 2010, I started my project, the Sprocket Podcast. We talk about bicycles, transit, adventures, and it's all presented in an irreverent style that has found a following, and so we keep on doing it. It's been a fun experience, been a rewarding experience. So I will tell you a little bit about that. I've got a couple of thoughts and a couple of things I'll share with you. Things we'll talk about as far as kind of what podcasting is. I'm sure all of us are at varying levels of engagement or understanding about what it is. But we can talk about some of that, and then I'd love to, once we've gone over that, kind of hear some of your questions. So that's what we're in for. And I understand we got to be out of here around 4:30. So we'll keep an eye on the clock as we need. But again, thank you for being here. So, well, I've been in love with.
I'm paneling with you.
Yes. Are you Reagan?
I am.
We have not yet met. Pleasure.
Nice to meet you.
Come on in. No, that's all right. So, yeah. Well, I was just going to start a little bit with kind of my experiences with talk radio, and then I would love to know yours as well.
Well, I came to listen to this panel. So.
Well, there we go. Very good. I have for a long time been really interested in talk radio, just in the idea that someone talks into a microphone, somebody else listens, and that sometimes if that happened in real life, you would just think that person was a bore because that person wants other people to listen to them all the time. But if you put a little barrier of some kind, if people just tune in, they hear that you're talking, and they're like, oh, I'm interested in what that person is talking about. There are opportunities. There always have been. It's changed a little bit of shape, but it's something that's happened for a long time. So I had a job back in 2004, and I'd always heard, like, for example, how many of you are familiar with Loveline? That was the program on the radio back in the day that I would listen to surreptitiously, so I didn't get in trouble for hearing people talk about naughty things on the radio. It was interesting because it was something I wanted to know about but didn't have access to. Loveline at the time was Dr. Drew, who is still producing Loveline with a different co-host. And at that time, it was Adam Carolla, who was the professional jackass. And his job, of course, was to make as many jokes as he could in the space that he was given. So it was interesting. It was something that I wanted to check out. Fast forward to 2004, I had a driving job. I spent a lot of time on the roads here in town. I was fixing ATMs, and they were all over the place. And so between repair jobs, I had a lot of time to kill behind the wheel, and I was very interested to hear kind of what was on the radio. I wasn't particularly interested in a lot of the political talk radio that was out there. I wasn't necessarily sure I agreed with most of what I was hearing, but I was interested in the exchange of ideas. I wasn't particularly interested in sports, but I know are there people out there who do like sports? I don't want to be offensive to you. I want to make sure you understand sports are okay. It's fine if you like them. But I didn't happen to be into sports, and so I was looking for something I could listen to that wasn't argumentative, wasn't combative like the political talk radio, wasn't trying to convince me like religious talk radio. And again, if you're religious, I'm not against that either. But everybody's got to find their own thing. I was looking for something that didn't quite exist yet. And one day, tuning along the dial, I found on I forget what station it was. The Rick Emerson Show was being broadcast out here in Portland. Anybody familiar with the Rick Emerson Show? Anybody been around or heard of it? He was a guy who he had moved from market to market, from station to station. At the time, I suppose he might have been the last of the shock jocks. but he wasn't necessarily out to offend anybody. He was just looking for a place where he could take his show that was about Led Zeppelin and Star Wars and talk about those things. And at the time, it was really hard to find a distribution outlet for stuff like that. These days, podcasting fills that niche because people can tune in as they like. But at that time, like I said, it was either politics or sports. I wasn't interested in either one. And suddenly I found someone that was talking about something I cared about. And so naturally I was a fan right away. So that was kind of how I fell in love with talk radio. And over the years, his show eventually lost traction with, as you know, if you're in radio or if you're exposed to radio, the market's a little volatile. At some point, someone says, we're going to flip this station. Now it's going to play oldies. And oldies are great too. I got no problem with them. But it means that, if oldies are going to sell more advertising, then the talk station flips. Podcasting is a place where you can talk and you can always target and you can send your messages out to the people that are interested in what you have to say. And so that was where my favorite show ended because the station flipped. But it was also some production staff from that started a show called Fun Employment Radio, which now has been, I want to say it's 2 or 3 years running Portland's funniest podcast, as voted in the Willamette Week user survey. And so they do a great thing. They've been around for a little bit longer than I have. I remember listening to them and thinking, oh, well, if they're making a show out of a spare room of one guy's bedroom, I could make a show out of a spare room. I know how to work a microphone. I know how to put stuff together. I know how to record things. So that was where I got my inspiration. Again, Fun Employment Radio, they're a great show. They're a lot of fun, and that was my inspiration for starting my show, the Sprocket Podcast, because I was looking for someone who had a similar tone, similar sense of humor, similar candor, and was talking about bikes. And at the time that I was looking for it, it didn't exist, and so I said, well, let's make a show. So that's kind of how I got into podcasting. How about yourself, Reagan? What did you find?
Well, backing up, I definitely don't know how to record anything still. I'm still working on that. So I was actually coming to this hoping to to learn something.
Let's get you some answers.
Yes, please help me with that. Couple years back, one of my neighbors, she runs a yoga studio in Rainier Beach called Rainier Beach Yoga. And she decided, because she's very community minded and very interested in social justice, that she wanted to host POC yoga. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there is a POC yoga movement, and it's an underground movement. And then we found out why it's underground. Because my friend, not knowing that it was an underground thing, sent it out to the people that usually frequent our yoga studio, just letting them know that this was an offering that was going to be happening at the space, and inviting folks who fit the genre to come, and inviting folks who did not to not come during those times, during that 1 hour a week. And one of her clients took exception to it and sent it into a radio station. And it became this huge story that resulted in her getting death threats. People from around the country were enraged by the idea of people of color doing yoga together, because that's terrible for some reason.
Can't believe it.
I know, yeah, it's terrible. So this became a thing. It lasted for about a year, where she was still receiving death threats on a regular basis. It was crazy. So I didn't know, this is how we met, actually. I didn't know her at the time. I didn't realize that this yoga studio that they were talking about was literally 3 blocks away from my house. But I did want to talk to her. And you can move my purse off the chair or whatever. I'll just, thank you.
The pamphlet said 345s.
That's all good.
No worries, you're great. So I decided, since it was in my neighborhood, that it was something that I wanted to provide some news coverage on. So as a journalist, I tried to meet with her, and I tried to meet with the other women who were running the POC yoga, and they were so overwhelmed with the media response that they wouldn't meet with me for a long while afterwards. But I did go ahead and write a piece about it to kind of balance out some of the narrative, because I felt like they were getting really slammed and that people weren't listening to what they had to say. And from that, I ended up getting invited onto the Dory Monson show, and he is one of the last shock jocks.
Gotcha.
And it was terrible, and I hated it.
What happened?
Oh, what you can imagine happened. I got on there, I held my own for about 20 minutes, and then like his talking in circles just, it made me dizzy and I got tired and I just kind of like shut down. And I thought, man, I want a rematch. Like, I want to, like, I want to be able to actually articulate what I really want to say in the moment. And then later on that year, I got the opportunity to go on The Record with Bill Radke for a completely different reason. And I discovered that radio doesn't have to be terrifying and scary and that you can actually have civilized conversations. So these are two things that like influenced me to kind of become interested in radio. And then after that, I was just thinking about what people have to say. Like, what is it that I actually have to say? And I feel like as a journalist, I'm always like writing and I'm always interviewing other people and kind of transcribing what it is that they have to say. But I felt like, one, kind of limited by that genre, and that I interview someone for an hour and then I use 3 sentences of what they said. But they said like amazing, amazing things. And it just never quite felt enough. So I thought, well, what if I had a podcast where I interviewed amazing people, but I got to talk, one, and then they got to talk, and it was a thing. So that's what I did.
At some point, could you guys show us how to upload a podcast to wherever? I don't even know.
Yeah, I learned this one.
Excellent.
I'd like to see
What is your podcast?
It's called The Deep End, or you can find it on iTunes under The Deep End Friends. I had to distinguish.
Are you still doing it?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, there's about 8 episodes out. I hit a snag because my radio engineer like had a family emergency and disappeared with 9 unedited episodes. So that was hard, but I did find him. I tracked him down and I got those episodes, but now he was the one who was editing and he can't be editing. So anybody interested in doing some free editing, contact me after this.
You're looking
Let's
for a person.
talk. I'm looking for a person. I don't have any money. I do have lots of food.
And I'm tempted by food. So you may have to fight me for this job.
I am a great chef, and that is part of like how the Deep End works as well as a podcast. My co-host Anastasia is super busy all the time. I'm busy. I work for a nonprofit. I work like 60 hours a week. So we do 1 day a month where it's a Deep End day, and everyone converges at my house. My host, me, my co-host, all of the guests, we record 4 episodes at a time, back to back to back to back, and then and have a lunch in between where the guests can eat and hang out and say cool things off the record that then we have to like try to get them to say on the record. And then I have a slew of interns who are also interested in learning. So now I have like mentors who are coming to mentor the interns on the things that I don't know how to do. So we're all kind of like learning together.
And let's share again. It was The Deep End Friends is what you said?
Yeah.
Which is how you find it on the iTunes store?
Yeah, on
Okay.
iTunes. It's free, of course. But
Yeah.
like you can just, if you're a person who listens to it on your phone, you can just find it. I don't know. I don't think so.
Not yet. And
But
we'll touch on that a little bit too, distribution channels, because that's definitely something that ties into your question as well.
It's hosted on Libsyn.
Yes. I'm interested just broadly because I think it's a really important thing, and depending on how you feel about the current times, I think there's definitely a need for voices that have whatever someone wants to say. There are a lot of people who have a valuable message that have, for most of media's history, haven't had a great way to get that message out. And the farther we go into this kind of new media environment where there used to be gatekeepers, you used to have to know a guy, you used to have to butter somebody up, you used to get into some payola scheme so that you could actually get your content on the air. And these days, the only payola is paying for hosting and getting your media somewhere where someone can download it later. But with podcasting, the traditional venues, even as great as public access is, you still have to come into a place and you have to record something and someone else has to put it up. Whereas if you're recording a podcast, you can make that at home. And obviously there are varying levels of quality, there are varying levels of whether it's a polished, edited show or whether it's just somebody's phone sitting on a table for an hour. But no one's telling you how to make your show, and you can put that out there. And again, I think, like you were saying, the story that you learned that you wanted to share, this is something that you can do now that you couldn't do earlier. And I think that's one of the best things about kind of the way things are. So just as far as I was making some notes here, kind of who listens, podcasting has become a household term. It used to be back in the day. I want to say the first podcast might have been 2004, thereabouts. There was a guy that's called the Podfather who came out with one of the first shows that was out there. But these days, there are anybody familiar with Startup, which was it was a podcast released by Gimlet Media. Gimlet was Alex Bloomberg and people he knew who started a company kind of getting out of public media. This American Life was a show he worked on as a producer, and he stepped out of that to go into business full-time as a podcast production company. So Gimlet Media makes such shows as Reply All, Homecoming is a fiction podcast that's out there, and there's a number of other ones. There's another network called Radiotopia. 99% Invisible is a show. Roman Mars is a name you might be familiar with. But there's a number of different commercial outlets that are releasing podcasts of great quality. They've got advertising dollars where people didn't have advertising dollars before, and so people know about podcasting, whereas they might not have before. And back in the day, you used to have to take an enormous web address and copy and paste it into a thing and then wait for hours for files to download. And these days, it happens like that when you touch a couple things on your mobile device. And so a lot more people are listening, which means that democratized medium, it used to be kind of a niche interest. You used to have to be techie to get into it. Now you're techie by default. And so this is a world where people can hear the voices they want to hear. As far as who makes them, again, we've got the major media companies who are making podcasts as a commercial venture, down to I don't know how commercial you are. We're not very commercial at all. We've just been making things, and honestly, I think when I look at the metrics, we've got 500 listens per week, which is not bad. It's also not huge, so it's not necessarily a way to get famous right away, but it's a thing that anybody can do. So it can be commercial. It can also be done by anybody, as long as you've got the time and as long as you've got the information you need. So
low power FM is another thing. Yeah, so is everybody familiar with the low power FMs in their respective areas? Yeah, well, that's another opportunity. If you are a podcaster and you have something that might be of interest to people in your neighborhood, connect with them.
Right, yeah, there's community radio, there's pirating it, which we can't recommend. That would be wrong, but it's possible. Do you listen to other podcasts, Reagan?
I do.
What do you enjoy?
I really love Another Round.
Another Round.
They're kind of my inspiration.
And what are they like?
They're just two amazing black women, Heaven and Tracy, sitting around with actual drinks, which you can hear through the podcast. And they
Drinking of the ice cubes?
Yeah, totally. They're like, "Oh, we're about to pour this drink," and I was like, "Oh, wow, why can't we do that?"
I wish I had a drink right now. Yeah.
Right? That martinis make everything better. And they do all sorts of things, social commentary. They interview people. They started out with BuzzFeed and got so popular that now they have access to celebrities. So if you listen to them, they had Hillary Clinton on. It was who does that on a podcast? But that's the power, I think, of this moment in media is that everything is accessible in a way that it never felt accessible before.
For sure, yeah, and many people might also be familiar with Mark Maron, who makes the WTF show, and he had the President Barack Obama in his garage, just in a garage. Apparently they had to surround it with a tent and have a bunch of FBI people all throughout the neighborhood. A bunch of documents signed, that sort of thing. But the fact is the president was in a garage talking to a guy who makes a podcast, which that's a new media landscape. So
goals.
There's a number of different kinds of things. The talk show format is what most people are probably familiar with, whether that's a formal talk show, such as Terry Gross's Fresh Air, or that's an informal thing like used to be called Nerdist, now it's ID10T, which looks like idiot if you look at it printed out. But that's Chris Hardwick, who used to be a VJ on MTV, and now he was the president of Nerdist, and he sold that, and now he has his own thing. But you've got people just talking to each other. You've also got monologue shows. not everybody can pull off a monologue. Some people are really good at it, some people are not. And all of those are out there. You can find both options. Fiction drama is something, radio drama has been a thing for years. It used to be that everybody would gather around the wireless to hear about the Lone Ranger, and now you can listen to fictional stories where people have mixed in sound effects and soundscapes and actors and that sort of thing. Audio from events such as conferences like this one, or if you're into a religious institution, a lot of them will broadcast their services. There's a number of different formats your audio can take. Basically, if it's something you can listen to with an earbud, you can find that somewhere on the internet. I've always described podcasts as on-demand TiVo for your ears. So it used to be, the joke with podcasting was you make one and then your parents are like, oh, when do I tune in? And the answer is you can tune in anytime you want, because it's not like even live streaming radio on the internet or anything like that. You can, you make a thing, you put it up there, and then whenever somebody wants that thing, they can pull it down off the internet. So there's almost no restrictions. The only restrictions are the ones you put on yourself. And occasionally, if you become super offensive, the major distribution outlets like the iTunes Store won't distribute you. And I think generally that's a prudent decision. But you got to be pretty offensive for that to happen. But you can speak the opinions. You're not beholden to a radio station's format or something like that. You can say the things you want. Which, again, with the democratization of new media, if there are stories that aren't being told, you can tell those stories, and that's a good thing. Audience engagement. One of the things I love about my show is that we can take letters. We always make space for people at the end after we do an interview with an interesting person. We have a calendar, headlines, and mail, and we read almost every letter that comes in. And that's been a good way to keep people on the hook. As far as if people are interested in sticking around, they might be more interested in being a fan of the show we make because they heard their own voice. And so I encourage people when I'm making my show to send in audio, to send a voicemail or voice recording, or send us something you recorded from where you were when something cool happened, because that's one way for other people's voices to be incorporated into our show, and that breeds loyalty. When I was a fan of talk radio, I would call in because I wanted to hear my voice on the radio, and so there's something about that. There's something endearing if you encourage people to become a part of your story. That will make it a part of their life as well as a part of yours. So, yeah. What do you know about your listeners?
Well, I actually did an invitation to my listeners to come in and join a live broadcasting or a live taping of the podcast. And I've done it twice. So once was for Shantina Vernon, which that episode is live if you want to check that one out. And it was really cool. One, just to see who actually responded to the invitation, because it's always a surprise who shows up. And then two, just to hear some of their questions as opposed to just the questions that we had. I did it again with a smaller audience at an art gallery for one that hasn't been released yet, but it was turning them into our guest, in which they weren't quite expecting. So there was definitely a little bit of resistance in the beginning.
How did you power through that? How did you get them to do it after all?
I knew a lot of them, and so I could be persuasive to people that I know well.
I'll buy you a drink later.
Yeah, I mean, there was food, of course. There's food and drink. That's like a huge component of our community. There's always food. There's always drink. There's always laughter. And we talked about just our process, Anastasia and my process of coming together as co-host and coming up with our questions, because we have about like 25 questions that we ask to every guest. We don't ask all of the questions to every guest, but we like give them the list of questions and then
master list you can draw from.
Yeah, and they just self-select which ones they're willing to answer, because there's definitely some that they're not willing to answer, and we want to respect that. But for the purposes of that podcast, we actually had everyone who's in the audience get into groups of 3, and they answered 3 or 4 of the questions as well. And then we came back and did a share back, and it was really rich.
That's really cool.
It was fun.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you have advertisers on your show, or how do you...
Not yet.
How do you get support? How do you make it go? It's
like pass the cup. Like, I make a really great triple chocolate rum cake.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and people show up for that.
What's your booking calendar like? Could I come down sometime?
Yeah, totally. We're going to start production again in June. My hope is between now and June that we can get those 9 other episodes edited and ready to go. we did have the opportunity to meet with some of our low power FMs, KVRU and Space 101.1, and they want to put us on. So we have to then go back and re-edit the ones that are already out to make the FCC happy.
Right.
And to not, get our fabulous low power FMs fined.
Yeah, it's surprisingly stiff fines for, as I'm sure
Stupidly
many of
stiff.
you who work with media organizations know. There are many words you can't say, and there's not a list to be easy. Like if George Carlin just gave us the list, and he did, but that's not all of them. There are a lot of ways you can offend people, and it's not a list. It's not static. It depends on the community that you serve, and so some things could be more offensive to some communities than others. And I mean, ultimately, that's a good thing because that means that we're being respectful of people if we're honoring those guidelines. But it does entail some editing. You might have made a show that was full of curse words, and they were fun ones, and the atmosphere was great, but you had to say, well, we got to cut this out, we got to cut it down, we got to get rid of that, we got to replace bleeps and bloops over some of these things. But yeah, editing down for broadcast on air is something that if your show does have those dirty words, then you have to pull them out. But
also more than dirty words, and this is what I learned because I took their FCC training course. I was like, ooh, I want to learn. Is things like endorsing things, because I'm definitely a big person who's like, go out and buy this person's book, and
Right.
you can't say that on the radio. I don't know why.
And it depends on who you work with. We had the Sprocket podcast was with X-Ray FM, which is a radio station here in town, for about 6 months. I was really glad that they gave us the opportunity. I was also glad when that time was up and they said we said we're moving on, because it turned out I think that the show we make isn't necessarily a great show for radio. It took so much work to get it radio broadcast ready that by the time we were done, we were just exhausted. It took too much time, and we didn't feel that we were gaining any traction. We didn't meet anybody. We didn't get mail from people who were like, "Oh, I heard about you on the radio. Heard about you on broadcast." And so, depending on what you want to make and what you want to distribute, for some people that's an amazing opportunity to get your voice out there. For other people, the audience you're looking for might not be on the airwaves. But I bring it up just because you were saying the whole call to action thing. Depending on the license that your radio station that you're working with has, some of them have an educational license or something similar. Some have a commercial license. So a commercial license can tell you, go out and buy this. It'll be great. It'll make all your dreams come true and all your problems go away. And that doesn't have to be true, but they can say it. An educational license, not only can you misinform people and get in trouble for it, but also if you tell them to do something, like, hey, these people make a great product, you should buy it. That's a call to action, and like you're describing, that gets fines too. So you have to know what you're working with. And again, podcasting, I think the great thing about podcasting is that, again, you can kind of make your own rules. So if you want to have an advertiser on your podcast, if you want to tell people to go out and do something because you think it's great, you got a friend that you believe in who's making something that people should buy, you can tell them to do that. But again, if it's on broadcast, those are slightly different rules. So.
Well, but go back to, how do you discern whether your podcast is a fit for the radio or not?
Right. I mean,
what's your thought on that?
Obviously, the management of the radio station would determine that. But we got a hand over here.
We've talked about that in KPW in Eugene, and there's a much narrower field of what you could do live on the air versus, on a website or in a podcast. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just so people can hear you.
Hi.
Hey,
We've
Rick.
discussed this at KPW Radio, and there's a much narrower field via the FCC on what you can do, because we're a non-commercial radio station. All LPFM are non-commercial radio stations, and you can do a wide variety of things on your website, on a podcast, but when it comes down to, there are rules that you definitely have to follow, because we have a lot of competing radio stations in our environment, and probably every environment, and if they hear something that they don't particularly care for on our little radio station, they can complain, and that's usually how the FCC even comes into the
It's a complaint-driven system.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if anybody else has comments as we go, just make sure you say them into the mic so that everybody can hear and everybody can participate. I think it's important to think about those sorts of restrictions. Basically, what are you making, and who can be served by your own judiciousness as you think about what you're going to share. Other things that I was thinking of was I won't put the plug in because this isn't the venue for it, but we've got a partner that's been serving beverages to our guests and to us for a long time, and they've been a great partnership. It developed organically. It's not the sort of thing. Some people think, oh, I'm going to make a podcast, and then step 2, we'll figure it out. Step 3, profit, and that, as we know, is an equation that doesn't always work out well. I think, depending on who you're making content for, did you start as a radio station affiliate, or did you just started making this because you wanted it to be out there?
Yeah. I very much feel like I'm still on step 1.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of how things went for me too. There was something I wanted to see that wasn't there, and we made it, and now it is. I think people can tell, and you all probably, having listened to media and consumed some media, you can kind of tell how people are motivated and what they're shooting for. Sometimes I'll hear a show that is just starting out, and they're trying so hard to make that advertising dollar work, and I find that you can partner with people really naturally in a way that makes them believe and trust you, because you're not just trying to get one over on your audience. You're actually saying, hey, this is something I like. These are people I like. These are people I really support. Or it could be an Audible ad, and so there are different ways that. And I'm not saying Audible's a bad company. I'm just saying that's like the one that you'll always hear. And I'm like, oh, yep, they're trying to cash in right away. You can go for that. You can try. But I think the first thing you got to do is figure out who you're talking to, make sure that you're connecting with your audience, and then once you know a little something about your audience, then you can figure out this is how we pitch to them. And it's not wrong to pitch. It's just it can be a little gauche to pitch financially at random or at people that you don't quite understand. So. What tools do you use? I was curious as far as getting your thing from. You sit around mics, you talk. Do you have an editor, or do you put it together yourself?
I have a friend.
There we go. You know a guy.
I know a guy, and he has a mic, and just it's a little tripod-y mic thing, and with the 2 microphones that come out, and then a third that you speak into the back of the mic. I don't know. I'm sure there's a more technical way to describe this system.
But it's multi-directional. It picks up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's multi-directional. Our levels are terrible because we laugh really loud and then we talk really quietly, and so we're fixing that. Bear with us.
That's why you have an editor.
That's why we have an editor. And then once everything is together, he sends it to me, and then I upload it into Libsyn, and then do the little. Libsyn. So
Libsyn is the platform you use to host, and this is the critical piece. Like I said, there's no gatekeeper other than the person you pay to keep that up there, so whoever wants to come around could come and grab it and take it into their ears. So Libsyn is probably the one that most people use. I think it's a pretty popular one. I use one that I won't name because I'm not super happy with it, but I'd like to switch to Libsyn at some point. If you go looking for podcast hosting platforms, you'll find them. And I think you can read reviews online. I'm not going to give any endorsements right now, but I will say the one you have is great.
I do want to LIBSYN, and it stands for, I think, Liberated Syndication.
Yeah.
So yeah, originally because this is not in my wheelhouse and I didn't know how to do it, I reached out, and my friend Sabrina connected me with this guy Paul, who sat me down and talked to me about all of this stuff and about which kinds of platforms you could host on, and he gave me a couple of recommendations, because what I ask for people who are really technical and actually understand all of this is to give me what I actually need to move forward, as opposed to the 99 million different ways that we can go. I don't want to be that divergent. So I will tell you, he gave me 2 recommendations. One was Blueberry and the other was Libsyn. I tried both. I prefer Libsyn. For about $20 a month, I can do all the things that I want to do, which is put out at least 2 or 3 episodes of the podcast, and then have the backlog hosted and put up really, the nice little pictures. And then it's got a way that you can, they have a tutorial within Libsyn on how to get your podcast hosted on iTunes. And when I tried that on Blueberry, it just was hours of me not understanding. Versus with Libsyn, in 20 minutes, it was accomplished. And I was like, oh, yeah, so
and there's
save yourself
a
some trouble.
Yeah. I'll also share, how many of you are somewhere close to Portland? A few. One of the things that we offer, I'm a part of, if you've been on the property here, you may have noticed the Airstream trailer in the back lot. And that's the Stream PDX studio. We have that as a rentable space to make audio in, but we also offer some classes in how, I teach an interviewing techniques class. We have one of our guys who teaches the how to post, how to get your thing onto iTunes and all the other outlets. And then we have somebody who teaches how to edit in Audacity, which is a free software. And one of the things, we got a thumbs up for Audacity. One thing that is great is that there are so many tools out there. If you have access to really professional tools, you can use them. A lot of times, if you buy an Apple laptop, it's going to have GarageBand built into it, which is a pretty intuitive, pretty useful program. You can buy other programs to edit audio with, but Audacity is one of the programs that's both for Windows or for Mac environments, and it's free. You can download it, and I tell people it's kind of like using knife scissors to cut something. You know, like you take two knives and you try and make scissors out of them. Audacity is not always the easiest thing to use, but it is free, and I've had a lot of success working with it. There's
Where
a
are
great
the scissors.
scissors are great too. Those are even better. So yeah, but that's one thing you've got. But there's a number of tools you can use. You can do professional audio editing, or again freeware, and then hosting and distribution we already talked about. So there were questions. You would ask the question about how to post your podcast, right?
Oh, I guess that would be through.
And go ahead and grab that mic if you want.
Yeah, I was just looking it up. It looks like it would be with
Libsyn. That's what you would upload it to.
That's the one you use, and I have a new show that I'm using that with as well. It's a good platform, yeah.
So are you saving it out as an MP? So are you saving it out as an MP3, and then you
MP3.
take that file and you put it to
And then
Libsyn?
upload through that.
And it's possible to use another, like an M4A or I want to say that's Apple's. I forget the acronym, but you can put them up. But most people use MP3 because it's kind of the industry standard. Yeah. FLAC, FLAC. That's the uncompressed audio. Those things are really big. And so if people are downloading them to their phones, unless they have unlimited data, that gets pretty hefty pretty quick. I'm sure there's some platform out there that does use that, but I think most people that are listening to podcasts are looking for an acceptable audio quality. I know someone asked about Spotify earlier. Spotify hosts or they don't host them, but they share podcasts. And I believe the requirement for Spotify is it has to be 128K BPS, so of a certain quality. I know for years I produced mine at 96K, which is a little bit lower, a little bit below the standard. The bigger your file is, the harder it is for people to listen to, even if they want to. If they're waiting for that download to finish. Stereo takes twice as long as mono for maybe obvious reasons. Stereo is 2 tracks, mono is just 1. But it's really important to make sure that you have a quality that sounds good, because if you compress, everybody I'm sure is probably familiar with compressing audio too far down to make it super tiny, then it ends up sounding like a tin can. And if you have really nice, like FLAC audio, for example, sounds amazing, but it's also going to be way too big for people to download on their phones, where most people are listening to their shows. So there are various ways you can do that. I recommend, I want to say 128 pans out to 64K mono, but I'm not sure if that's what Spotify is looking for or not. So there are ways to share, but we can also get into the weeds on that. So yeah. And another question?
Do you guys use a ID3 editor, and what is that?
I want to say that's the metadata. So like if you've got iTunes or some other media program, you'll be playing your song, and it's somebody give me a song.
Can't touch this.
Can't Touch This by MC Hammer.
Right.
So you got that line on your media player that shows you're listening to Can't Touch This by MC Hammer from Please Hammer Don't Hurt 'Em, 1991. Is it 91?
Gosh, whoa. You
I was
are
a
the
fan.
metadata.
So ID3 editors will edit those tags, and you can get as deep into that as you want, but at the very least, people will know when they look at their machine what they're listening to, because that tag says this is Can't Touch This by MC Hammer. So I put that into all my shows. I use iTunes to do it once I make my MP3, but there are a number of ways you could make that happen. So yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any stats on the average time people listen to a podcast? Like, what is an ideal podcast time?
There are a number of ways. Do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, okay, I have what I've been told and then what I've experienced. And so what I've been told is that like a half an hour is a long time in podcast world and that you should just really keep it short. And I ignored that completely. So mine are all at least an hour because of the format. Like I wanted to do in-depth interviews with people and I wanted to give them actual time to get to the juice. And people listen to them in their entirety.
Yeah. Anybody remember Joe Rogan from Wrestling and Fear Factor? He does a podcast that is unedited, and every one that drops is like 3 or 4 hours long. Mm-hmm. I don't know who listens to that. Apparently someone does because he's popular on iTunes, but you do. Here's one of our fans. Did I offend you? I'm sorry.
One of the things is about the podcast that I think is really cool is that I don't necessarily listen to it nonstop for several hours or whatever. I come back to it. Oh,
you can bookmark that and come back.
I can take it with me. So I think that's an important thing to realize.
For sure.
But I don't think time is that big a deal because I can come back to it when I want to.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing. Is it depends on who you're looking to serve. Some people are really into a really short, concise, like a drive time show. Like 20 minutes would get you from home to work in some situations, and your show would be just long enough to fill that time. Other people, such as yourself, enjoy the show that you can drop into, listen to, go away, and then come back and pick up. So, yeah, again, I hope I didn't offend you. That's, I hear he's great.
So, when we were first getting into audio editing, we went through a number of programs, and we ended up landing on Audacity because you can go to YouTube, and there is a whole series for the dummy of editing in Audacity, and I haven't seen that in any other audio program.
Yeah.
So it's really good for people to know that even if they don't know what's going on, and you can download Audacity even on Linux, so it's a multi-platform editing, and I highly recommend it.
Open
from
source.
Personal experience.
Yeah, open source.
Nice.
Yeah, and if you say you get 3 or 4 hours of audio with somebody and you just want to choose the best bits that you can share with people, Audacity is one great way to do that, to kind of cut things down to a manageable size if you're trying to make a show with a smaller format. So, question?
Yeah. Oh, that's loud. Do you, at least personally, do you two like to try to keep your actual recording session at about the same length that you want the podcast to be, or do you just have as long a conversation as you want to have and then end up cutting out a lot of it?
We tend to go over just because of the nature of my podcast. And I think it's important to go over, especially now that we're doing all these FCC edits, because if not, like we might not have gotten to an hour of content really if we didn't go over a little bit. But I don't know. I don't want to go. I don't like to go too much over. It just really depends on the conversation and just the vibe and if people are really present or not.
Have you identified exactly what percentage of your show is usually profanity and pitches for something?
Honestly, there's not a lot of profanity because I do have a lot of youth interns and I try to keep it clean for them.
There we go. You're doing good work.
Like honestly, and also just some of the things that we're talking about, it just doesn't.
Right.
It's not about that. We're not.
It doesn't lend itself to the profane.
We're not talking about pop culture.
Right.
Like we're talking about what's your heart's passion. And it's usually not profane.
Right. That's good.
Like what's freedom? What's the definition of freedom? That kind of a thing. But in terms of like pitches, I feel like we interview a lot of people who are so underrated that we do tend to be like, please go and
check
see
these
this
people
show.
out.
Go see them dance. Go see them sing. Go buy this book. But it doesn't take that long to say that.
Yeah.
So.
And you were saying that you're going for a kind of an organic, like a natural length of something, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mentioned Chris Hardwick's ID10T podcast, and he tends to clock in pretty consistently around an hour 15. And that's not because they cut, well, I don't know, maybe they edit. It doesn't sound like it's edited, but you never know. But I think it's pretty cool that you can kind of see like the natural length of a conversation with someone that you don't know that well is going to be about an hour 15. It's nice to know that you don't have to be limited to an hour unless you're producing for TV or radio or something like that. But there's also, different people are going to have different lengths for things. My show has a couple different segments, and so sometimes the interview is really short, sometimes the interview is really long. We've done episodes that are 45 minutes long. We've done episodes that are an hour and 45 minutes long. And I think an hour and 45 is a bit too long. But again, it depends on your listeners, depends on how long they're willing to kind of ride the bull and hang on, or get off the bull and come back and get on again later. So there are different ways to do that. I think it's important to kind of sense that, though, as you're making your own shows, as you're making your own content, you'll probably feel a little bit, whether that's the prick of conscience saying that you've gone too long, or it's just kind of feeling like, oh, this feels good, or this feels like we're done. You may feel that as you're talking to your guests. And again, depending on your format, that's, again, the great thing about podcasting is you can make a show that's as long as you want it to be or as short as you want it to be. I think some people become accustomed to a certain length. So if they tune into your show every week and they're like, oh, I'm expecting a half hour for my drive time, and then suddenly you drop a 2-hour show on them, they'll be like, I can't handle it. But it depends. It really depends. People come to some shows for certain things and some shows for others. So yeah, you have to find out kind of what your audience is looking for. Can we pass the mic down there? Or you had one also?
Guest research?
Guest research? Question mark. So you're asking, should we research our guests?
How much?
Yeah, it's a good question. How much do you do?
Well, I mean, so since my background is in journalism, a lot of the guests that we had, especially in the beginning, are people that I had already interviewed for other things. So I did a lot of research beforehand for that and just kind of rolled it into that. Or they're people that we're in community with, either me or Anastasia, my co-host, kind of have a sense of their work. I think it's important, though, when you're going to talk to someone, to know what you're getting into, and at least have some like basics on things that work that they've done, so that you can ask appropriate questions.
Right, because if you have, say you have President Barack Obama in, and you ask them the question, so what's it like being president? Like that's not an educated, well-researched question. That's not going to yield great results. And he can answer the question, but yeah, you could do better, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for not necessarily having an exhaustive knowledge, because I think when you ask a question with genuine interest and you are genuinely surprised in your response, that's something that it's nice to catch on tape. But I also don't necessarily subscribe. I used to say, save it for the show, let's not talk. And that just gets awkward. So I think there's something to be said for knowing enough about the person so you know what questions to ask. But yeah, I think just because you know something doesn't mean that you can't say in an interview, oh, we were talking before we started recording and you mentioned you had some experience with this. Because if you ask someone to retell a story, they can, if it's a good story, they've probably told it a couple of times, they can do it. If you're trying to get them off of script and you know that they tell this story to everybody they go and talk to, you might ask them a question that they don't expect and you don't know the answer to. That might get them their wheels might turn in an interesting way, and you might get something that's podcast gold. You might have the exclusive scoop. I listened to Al Gore was doing the podcast circuit last year around his new, it was the sequel to An Inconvenient Truth, I believe, and he was on Fresh Air, he was on WTF with Mark Maron, he was on The Nerdist. I listened to all 3 interviews, and he was giving the same answers on all 3 shows. Now, that's not surprising because everybody has their own pitch. They have their own script that they kind of stick to. But I think the most interesting, especially for people who do a lot of media, the most interesting things are when you figure out what they haven't told somebody else yet. What's your unique angle to this? And not that, again, that the points are bad because, I like what Al Gore put together, but I think it's interesting when you can tell that someone's just kind of giving their talking points, and it's most interesting when you can get them off of them. So, something to think about. Was there anything else you wanted to hit while we're up here? I also wanted to make space for questions and answers, but if there's something else that you wanted to address.
I would just say, and maybe this is redundant, but passion. Like, be passionate about whatever it is that you're doing. That's all. Like, I think, like you were saying before, that there is such a unique opportunity now with podcasts to be the voice that isn't heard, or to provide kind of a counter narrative, or to put out the media that you've always dreamed of putting out there, because we have no restrictions and you can do it on like $20 a month or whatever. Like it's very accessible.
Or 15 or 5.
Or yeah, I mean, definitely you could go even lower, but like, what do you really have to say? What really needs to be out there? What are the conversations that will be transformative and groundbreaking and that what is the thing that you most need to hear. And for me, it's been really interesting working with Anastasia. We both come to the work from different places. So for me, like when we started this podcast, it was because I needed it. Like this was literally, these were the conversations I personally needed to have. I could give a shit about anybody else and what they needed versus Anastasia, who's very much like looking out for the community and looking out for like what everybody else is wanting. But I feel like we kind of meet in the middle.
You need both of those aspects to make a really interesting show.
It's pretty good.
So how do people find your project again?
The Deep End Friends. You can find us on Libsyn or on iTunes.
And there's a
It's
website
around.
as well. They can Google that.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. And
Well,
I'm the Sprocket
used to be.
Podcast, thesprocketpodcast.com. And streampdx.com is kind of our community audio studio. So before we break out, did anybody else have any questions or anything we didn't get to yet? And
I was
grab
just-
that mic.
I just wanted to know, like, what are some of the, I guess, strategic ways to disseminate your podcast out to different, like, LPFMs and community radio stations once you get to that level of, like, being confident in your content?
Ooh, like most things, it was an accident. Like, I
So
just
have a happy accident.
have a happy accident. I do think that you can, of course, come to conferences and meet people, and that's one thing. I find that when you have FaceTime with people, it's easier. It's easier for you to find connections and for them to trust your work. So in the case of me, like the person who started one of the LPFMs in my neighborhood is someone I know because I've been covering this neighborhood for the last 5 years. You know, we swim at the pool together, and she just mentioned, oh yeah, now I'm the program manager for KVRU. And I'm like, have I got a podcast for you? Like, and then whereas another woman just kind of accidentally stumbled upon my podcast. And so then she came to the live broadcast and was like, I'm with Space 101 and we love it. Like, I love this and I want to put you on. And I was like, great.
Yeah, and never underestimate the power of a good cold sell. Just like finding out someone who might be interested and just saying, hey, here's a well-worded, short, brief, to-the-point email. Would you like to have my show on your airwaves? Or let me call the office and say, hey, who would I talk to about this? Yeah, and then like you were saying, you make connections. If you have guests on, I found that our show got distribution not necessarily, but just like traction and finding other people who are interested by that person has fans, we have people who listen. You put those people together, and some of those are going to stick to each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Mike went back here.
Your shows are popular and the
Thank
people
you.
listen. And but are there those putting out controversial views and unpopular speech? And what are there safety concerns, or have you ever dealt with that issue?
I think maybe the biggest danger I can think of is that we know that media as a whole is kind of starting to fracture into interest groups, and it's really easy to find people who agree with you, and it's really easy to shout down people who don't. And all those channels, whether it's social media, like on Facebook, the algorithm serves you stories that you're interested in, or whether that is that your show is only being listened to by people who agree with you. That's one thing, but you're kind of asking from the other direction. If you put your message out there and somebody doesn't like it, could that be dangerous in some way? I mean, you definitely have to be careful, like slander and libel are still things, and you can still get sued for them, so you have to be careful about how you talk about other people and things, especially if you disagree with them. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of experience with that because most of the people that find our show are people who like what we're saying, so, yeah.
If people, violently disagree with you, is there a way for them to track you down?
Don't give them your address. Well, one thing is that if you've got a website, a domain, a lot of places will have that sort of protection. Like you can kind of anonymize yourself, like the web host or the domain server has your information, your name, but they don't share that with the public. It's not publicly accessible. So that's something I'd recommend if you own a domain that you do. And yeah, if you're going to have people mail you stuff, have them mail it to a public location or whatever, as
P.O.
opposed to
box.
your house. Yeah, P.O. boxes are great.
But also a lot of people don't care enough to do that. You know what I mean? I mean, like legit, like they just,
Yeah.
if they probably would stop listening to you before they did anything.
And words may hurt you, but that's not the worst that could happen, I guess.
So I just want to say, as somebody that I listen to a lot of different podcasts and consume a lot of them, varying from 15 minutes to 2 hours and stuff. But I think one important thing as a consumer of that, to tell anybody that was going to do it, is for me, having somebody that puts something out on a regular basis is really, really important. If you're going to start one, don't just do one and then someday do another one. The being regular is, I would think, to me, is like one of the biggest things for me to get hooked on a podcast.
Consistency is very important. And what's your frequency of your show?
We were doing it once every 2 weeks, and then we got blocked by this whole my tech person disappearing.
Oh yeah.
So we had a lot
of frequency
of really,
right now is not as much as it would be otherwise.
No, so we're kind of we're framing it as like, oh, that was this one season. Stay tuned till the next season,
Yep.
and then once we're ready, we'll like put out another one that'll be every other week again.
Right. Because when I started doing mine, it was just we're going to do a show every week from here until eternity, and that starts to burn you out over time. I'm actually on hiatus right now from the show. I got a lot going on in life and all that, but. Yeah, you mentioned seasons, and that's one of the things that can be great is that now people will binge on something, whether it's TV or podcast series or whatever. You can make something of a limited run and say, hey, this is going to last for this long, and then there's going to be more later, some other time. So that could keep you from being burnt out.
Yeah,
But
I do think you're right about momentum. Like once you have that momentum, that's why I was really mad. Is we had momentum, we were getting traction, momentum. And then
people are a little fickle too, or there's all this other competition out there. So you go away for a while, and I'm looking for something else, and then I may get hooked onto that. So
you're one of those lucky people who has enough time to actually exhaust your queue.
That's
right.
Very good.
Ooh, that I could.
Anybody else? Yes, you make
The Deep End.
The Deep End or Deep End Friends, and the Sprocket Podcast. And I just started a new thing called Playlist Commentary, which is kind of like you'd watch a movie and listen to a commentary in your ear. We make a commentary for a playlist on Spotify. I'm not sure. It's super niche. You need 2 machines. I haven't figured it out yet. But cool. So please, if you have any other questions or if you want contact so we can correspond, let me know. And I don't know if you want to share your email or not, but you can. So anyways, be in touch, and thank you all for being here. So best wishes. Podcast long and loud.
Thank you.